In addition to all the death and disease among soldiers and civilians, World War I was a horrifying excuse for global leaders to be on their worst behavior. Here's why the Great War was even worse than you thought. On the war's western front, soldiers on both sides of the conflict dug long, deep ditches to protect themselves from enemy gunfire. These trenches also served as their homes for weeks at a time. They were built with planks of wood, sandbags, sticks, and barbed wire. Or when none of those elements were available, they simply used mud. The idea of fighting from trenches had been around for centuries, but by World War I, weaponry had advanced considerably, so trenches now protected men from machine guns and artillery attacks from the air. At the start of the war, both sides launched attacks from their respective trenches, while also climbing out and running toward the enemy through the space between them, which was known as no man's land. As you might expect, trench warfare was bloody and brutal, resulting in massive casualties on both sides. That was especially evident in the Battle of the Somme in 1916, when British forces experienced more than 57,000 casualties, including 19,000 deaths on just the first day of the battle.
Life in a trench, I'd like to explain in one word: horrific.
The specter of being killed by the enemy wasn't the only thing hanging over the heads of combatants in the trenches. In 1915, doctors working on the Western Front found themselves inundated with soldiers suffering from a mysterious illness. Symptoms including headaches, backaches, dizziness, and stiffness in the shins. Within months, it was so widespread that it became known as trench fever. Though rarely fatal, trench fever grew common enough that it was a logistical nightmare. Those who were afflicted were too ill for combat and were typically sent away from the front for up to 3 months. Researchers eventually determined the cause of the illness, the common louse, or more specifically, louse excrement that was transmitted into the bloodstream via skin abrasions. With no medical treatment available, the solution was to keep the soldiers as free from lice as possible. A variety of methods were attempted, including bathing regularly in addition to sterilizing uniforms with steam. The Brits finally got a handle on things by developing a paste that proved quite effective at eliminating the lice. World War I was also notorious for its large-scale use of chemical weapons. The French were the first to introduce chemical warfare when they lobbed grenades loaded with tear gas. The Germans then raised the bar by developing a method to disperse clouds of chlorine gas, which could be just as hazardous to those utilizing it if the wind happened to shift in the wrong direction. But chlorine gas didn't last long. Eventually, the most common chemical weapon used during World War I was mustard gas, which caused chemical burns and respiratory problems. While mortality rates from mustard gas were low, the psychological damage was significant. Numerous soldiers wound up experiencing gas fright, in which they acted defensively even when there was no threat of gas. An unexpected and deadly phenomenon swept the globe towards the end of World War I, a pandemic known as the Spanish flu. It first emerged in the spring of 1918 with a seemingly harmless fever that lasted just a few days, but by the fall, it had mutated into a far deadlier version. Some people were dead within hours of first experiencing symptoms, while others survived mere days until fluid filled their lungs and caused them to suffocate. Despite the name, the first documented case of the Spanish flu was in Kansas. Young men on their way to serve in the war unknowingly carried the virus, and it spread quickly among servicemen living in close quarters. Once they made it to the trenches in Europe, it swept across the continent as mortality rates grew to a staggering 10% in some areas.
It was a phantom, and we didn't know where it was.
The Spanish flu was ultimately responsible for the deaths of as many as 50 million people. By the time the pandemic ended, it had caused the deaths of 675,000 Americans, a greater number of U.S. casualties than World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War combined. While post-traumatic stress disorder is now a widely acknowledged side effect of combat, that was by no means the case during World War I. Nevertheless, it was widespread and known at the time as shell shock. That term was first coined by soldiers on the front lines who witnessed comrades who were so crushed by the horrors of war that they were simply unable to function. When British troops began experiencing PTSD on a widespread basis, military leaders decided to consult Dr. Charles S. Myers, an expert in psychology. While he could treat patients on an individual basis, he recommended that the British Army set up specialized units to treat the psychological casualties that resulted from massive battles. However, Myers faced an uphill battle in converting the hearts and minds of those who believed that soldiers suffering from shell shock were simply lazy or cowardly. Despite his efforts, the vast majority of British soldiers with PTSD remained untreated. That was also the case among the soldiers of all the other nations involved in the war. Some truly awful things often take place in the midst of combat, and World War I was no exception. Perhaps the worst of all was the Armenian genocide, when the Turkish government in charge of the Ottoman Empire utilized the war as an opportunity to achieve its nationalist goals. In 1915, the Turks began the deportation and outright killing of Armenians. When the genocide finally concluded in 1922, an estimated 600,000 to 1.5 million Armenian people had been slaughtered, and many more were displaced. There were other incidents during this time that were just as ugly. For example, when the Germans invaded Belgium, there were widespread reports of atrocities committed against civilians, including rape, arson, pillaging, and murder. A commission was established to determine whether these reports were accurate. They concluded that they were, and that killing civilians and burning down entire villages had become widespread among German soldiers. At the beginning of World War I in 1914, the Canadian government enacted the War Measures Act, which provided vast powers to suspend civil liberties during wartime. So the government rounded up thousands of so-called enemy aliens, meaning immigrants from nations that Canada was now at war with. Many of those imprisoned were of German descent, although the vast majority of them came from Ukraine. They were sent to remote rural internment camps, while their possessions and money were confiscated. There were 24 such camps scattered throughout the country. Those imprisoned were put to work on massive projects and paid so little that it was essentially slave labor. In addition to those placed in the camps, more than 80,000 immigrants from various Eastern European nations were forced to regularly report to authorities and carry identity cards denoting their status.
These were white European nationals.
Right, but they were the other at that time.
It wasn't until 2005 that the Canadian government finally acknowledged its shameful actions, with the House of Commons passing a bill known as the Ukrainian-Canadian Restitution Act. There's no question that World War I was one of the largest in human history. With more than 30 nations involved, a staggering 60 million men were estimated to have fought over the course of the conflict, though it shouldn't come as a surprise that the volume of casualties was also higher than any previous conflict. Historians are uncertain about the precise number of casualties, though the total is estimated at somewhere between 6 million and 13 million. The reason for that wide range is that some casualty estimates include those who died from war-adjacent causes like the Spanish flu and the Armenian genocide, while others don't. However, a 2011 report by the Robert Schuman European Center determined that about 9.7 million military personnel lost their lives due to the war itself, while an additional 6.8 million civilians died during the same period. That adds up to a total of approximately 16.5 million people dying as a result of World War I. The winning side actually experienced far greater losses, as Allied forces suffered casualties of 5.4 million personnel, while that number for the Central Powers was 4 million. As brutal as conditions were for the soldiers who fought in the trenches, they were even worse for those who were conscripted by Britain from its colonies. For example, the British Indian Army was a massive force of 1.5 million troops, and its backstory represents colonialism at its worst, with a massive recruitment effort promising Indians substantial monetary rewards for joining. But once they signed on, they discovered that they were being paid just a fraction of their British counterparts. Meanwhile, they were also subjected to racism and issued inferior equipment. Their provisions, barracks, and medical care were also substandard. A similar situation played out with the British West Indies Regiment. While Indian soldiers fought alongside British soldiers, the black members of the West Indies were initially relegated to supporting roles, such as digging trenches, loading equipment, and removing injured soldiers from the battlefield on stretchers. That work was particularly dangerous as it put them within the range of German artillery fire. The West Indies recruits were also the victims of racism, including the denial of a pay increase given to British soldiers. Frustrations over this discrimination eventually boiled over in Taranto, Italy in December 1918, when West Indies recruits launched a 4-day mutiny against their officers. It's fair to say that America's skill at wartime propaganda really came of age during World War I. President Woodrow Wilson was elected largely on his promise to keep the country out of the war, and there was initially little desire among the citizens to enter the conflict. So some serious finesse was required to persuade this reluctant nation otherwise.
More than any single person, it was in his power to determine whether we fought or not.
So Wilson put PR professional George Creel in charge of both propaganda and censorship throughout the country. In order to whip up a pro-war frenzy and convince young men to enlist, Creel commissioned a series of posters and pamphlets that depicted German soldiers as vicious guerrillas clutching bare-breasted maidens in one hand while holding a bloodied club in the other. Creel's strategy worked, though his demonization of the Germans also yielded unintended consequences when mobs began forming to harass and terrorize innocent German immigrants. Meanwhile, churches that expressed pacifist views were set on fire, while anyone who appeared to be unpatriotic was at the risk of being tarred and feathered. Whenever any of these vigilantes were captured and placed on trial, juries were reluctant to convict them, fearing that they themselves could become victims of similar outrage.
World War I is this moment where propaganda is used in a very heavy-handed way, but George Creel did it brilliantly.
For those who fought in World War I, death was everywhere around them, whether in the form of battlefield injuries, poison gas, or a flu pandemic. For some soldiers who became psychologically incapable of coping with these daily horrors, one option that loomed was desertion. Within the ranks of British armed forces, approximately 10 of every 1,000 soldiers attempted to desert. But those who were caught and found guilty faced a grisly fate: execution by firing squad. Overall, Britain executed 266 deserters during World War I. A Scottish soldier named Private John Macaulay witnessed and wrote about one such execution. He recognized the deserter as someone he'd trained with, while some members of the firing squad were from the condemned man's hometown. As Macaulay observed, "I still say that fear of facing a firing squad had little effect on the man whose nerves were shattered beyond repair and who eventually became panic-stricken at the horrors surrounding him." The United States, meanwhile, was far more lenient with its deserters. All told, 5,584 American servicemen were charged with desertion, and 2,657 were convicted. Of those found guilty, 24 were sentenced to death, though none were executed, with President Woodrow Wilson commuting all of their sentences to prison terms.